The Undergang Armchair.
Let's get this show on the road. It's Ondo again. We're here for episode 3 of the Undergang Armchair podcast. Welcome. Have a seat. Join us. We're sitting here in my living room. I should say our living room, but between you and I, we'll say my living room. Here in Nørrebro in Copenhagen. The last of the afternoon sun is shining on the buildings across from us. All the leaves have fallen off the trees. And it's pretty cold out there. One of the things Danes love to talk about is the weather. And I have completely fallen into that. If you're standing in an elevator and you don't know what to say to anybody, you talk about the weather. And it's very ingrained in Danish culture. In fact, I saw a hilarious TV program once where they asked the Chinese people what they would think if in an elevator you talked to them about the weather. And they'd think you were kind of weird, apparently. They talk about their jobs, is what they said. I think they also talked with a Kenyan. I don't remember what Kenyans talk about when they're stuck in an elevator with strangers. It also brought to mind, I don't know what Americans talk about. What do we talk about when we're stuck in an elevator? My thought is that we talk about anything. Americans will just talk about whatever. I think maybe otherwise it would be family. Talk about your family, talk about your day. I mean, Americans have that thing where you go, how are you? And someone goes, I'm fine, thanks. Or, I don't know. For me, it's okay to be like, I'm doing all right. Or I'm hanging in there. And then proper etiquette is you say, oh, that's good. You don't say, oh, what's going on, buddy? So we're all different like that. But I think it's easy to have the weather to talk about because it's always there in Denmark. Either it's great or it's horrible, essentially. You never hear anyone say, oh, the weather's okay today. But, yeah, that's what we talk about here in Denmark. Our guest today is Claus Carstensen. I have decided he's the patron saint of art in Denmark. He's a guy who a lot of people know, also outside of the art world. He's prominent in Danish society. He was a professor for many years at the Art Academy. He has been in the newspapers. He's outspoken. He's an intellectual. He's educated. He's self-educated and educated. And he enjoys debate and discussion and engagement. So it was great to sit down and talk to him. He dropped some serious knowledge on us, both about where he comes from and about what it was like being an artist in Denmark in the 70s and 80s. About being a professor, teaching versus making art. There was a lot of things we didn't get to that I wanted to get to, so we're probably going to have to ask him back one day, talk more about, I don't know, politics, anarchy, juicy subjects like that. But we got a pretty good round here with him, and learned a lot about where he comes from, especially. So please enjoy the interview with Claus. Thanks. One of the things I noticed about Denmark too. In America, they have the government will speak your language to you. You can get websites in your language. You can get forms in your language.
Denmark,
no, in America.
Yeah.
And in here, they speak Danish, and that's it. Maybe you can get English, but you have to fight for it. So it's definitely a different attitude, and that's why you can be official. You don't have to be an illegal immigrant, and you still don't have to speak English. Which, of course, infuriates.
Which breaks up the society, I think. Because if you see what really kept the Jewish having no land for 2,000 years, what really kept them was hommes de lettres. They were people of letters. They spoke the language, and the language 2,000 years old, and they have the literature. Jewish exile literature is well known.
Yeah.
So I think that's really part of it.
Yeah, it's hard for me to figure out what's better because obviously there should be some sort of aim to integrate, but at the same time, I feel like it's a little more open in the U.S. anyways. Even though
look at me, I speak Sønderjysk with my family, and I have to speak rigsdansk when I come to Copenhagen.
This is perfect. Let's get to you.
Okay, yeah.
You come from Jutland.
So now you have to turn it on.
It's been on.
It's been on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but
we're just warming up.
Okay, good. I come from Jutland. Yeah.
What's that like?
Different from growing up on Sjælland, but the language basically. And when I grew up, I speak a Jutland dialect, which is, if you enter the United Nations, I think it's UNESCO side of dying languages, Sønderjysk, the dialect is called. It's more or less dying. I think in Denmark we've got 3 dialects dying, and it's Frisian, Sønderjysk, and Bornholmsk.
Okay. What is it really that different? Is there different words?
The old one, as my grandmother spoke it, it's very different. It's a mix of German and Danish and English and Dutch and Frisisk. So like a bottle, which in Danish is a flaske, would in Sønderjysk in the old days would be a bottle.
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 Bottle, is that from German?
No, English, bottle.
Okay.
There's a lot of violin would be a fiddle, and so you've got a lot of
English
words, but also many German words.
Does everybody speak German too?
That's the other thing, because I grew up in these days where the national Danish TV had a total. What do you call it? A total control. Yeah, monopoly and control. And there was one channel, and the German television had 3 channels. So, which was much more interesting than the Danish channel. And then we couldn't get the Swedish TV as the Copenhagen area could, but we could definitely get the German TV. So there's a whole part of Denmark, southern Funen, southern Zealand, and southern Jutland kids who in the 60s and 70s grew up with German television. And
almost as the first language then.
And in Sønderjylland, it's not the first language. Yeah, it is the first language after Danish, of course. Yeah.
Right.
And but I grew up then with the German heritage because my family is from both sides of the border, the nowadays border. But in 1864, when the border was moved up to Kolding, and then in 1920 again, when it was moved down to the now existing border, there's been the Schleswig-Holstein has been it's a mix of bilingual, binational mix, and which caused the wars in the 19th century, and which nowadays works perfectly well as ambulance system working, logistics of
they share those kind of services.
Yeah. So if you get sick in a certain part of southern Denmark, you'll be delivered to a German hospital and so on and so on. So it's quite open, and my father actually was one of the first ones who crossed the border in the sense of working in Flensborg every day, living in Sønderborg. But since he was part of the German minority, he was good at speaking German, and then he was hired for a job at Danfoss as what do you call it, economy director in Flensborg.
Does that mean that you felt different from other people in Denmark when you
my political growing up was quite precise. Let's say quite aware of the differences in my first ideology. Let's say test was when in 1966, when the English soccer team won against the the World Cup against Germany on Wembley Stadium in London, Of course, as part of the German minority, I would be a fan of the German team.
Right.
And I was in a Danish school. I was raised in a German kindergarten, but a Danish school, primary school, and middle school and folkeskole. And I came to the courtyard. And it was been the second grade, I guess. Yeah, I started in school in '64, so it's been the second grade. And I came and I said, great, no, shit, we lost. And they said, lost? We won, of course. So I was quite aware of that.
And then you stood there going, right, we won.
But my first language is actually Sønderjysk, and the Danish, the Danish dialect.
But I don't hear it in your voice normally now. That may be me speaking Danish.
I think it's you. Some people can easily hear it, but it's there's another border, which is a language border, which starts in Rømø and goes to Haderslev in southern Jutland, and then to Ringe on Fynen, and then to Næstved in
all the way across.
All the way across, and the people south of that don't have beats in the language, a certain beat, and that beat. It's very hard to regain that beat again. If you don't have it, you have to go. I only know one southern Jutlander who got it, and that's Ralf Pittelkov, who kind of had a very strange relationship to his. He was speaking dialect, so he went to when he came to Copenhagen in order to study science of literature. He went to a logoped. I don't know what's it called. A guy who teaches languages.
Okay, like a speech coach.
Speech coach, yeah. Where the speech coach coached him into having beats in his language.
Okay.
So
because that was proper, or because he wanted
proper because you can hear if people don't have it. I mean, I can tell. I can even tell if a few years ago 10 years ago, walked into a bank and a guy came up and said, "May I help you?" And I said, "Oh, you're from Åbenrå." And he said, "How do you know?" "Because I'm speaking proper Danish." And said, No, I can tell.
I got you.
I got you. So it's quite easy to hear. So language has always been a very, let's say, very experienced and very aware part of my being brought up and my childhood.
And being different somehow.
And of course, also being different. Because, for instance, in kindergarten, I was in German kindergarten, and I mixed plum and cherry. I mixed plum and cherry, and and then when I said cherry and I meant plum, and I even pronounced cherry, which in German is Kirsche, and I pronounced it as Kirche, which is church. So I mixed it up totally. So I was sent into the corner with a gaffer tape on my mouth, and then I could stand in the corner from 9 in the morning to 12 at noon, being ashamed, and as Kippenberger sculpture, up in the egg, ashamed dich.
That's a different kind of
that was
So did you feel ashamed, or did you just plot?
Not at all. No. I was really, I was in rage and revolt, and I almost forgot the incident. But then, like 5, 6, 7 years ago, I met at a party in Copenhagen. I met a girl, Traudi, who was in the kindergarten at that time. She's now doing opera for Holland House. And we were talking, and then she said, "Do you remember when you had the gaffer tape on your mouth?" And afterwards, we met in the room next to where you had stood, and then she said, "And then you said, but we still keep on speaking the southern Jutland dialect." Which we were not allowed to because it was a German kindergarten.
Right.
So even a southern Jutland dialect, which has a lot of German words, is still considered wrong and Danish. Wow. But it's a strange thing about the southern Jutland dialect because, for instance, Emil Nolde, who was born now, it's a Danish, the most southern part of Denmark, the little village Nolde, where he was born. He was named Emil Hansen, and he changed his name into Nolde after the village. But he was speaking, he felt German. He was a part of the German minority, but he was speaking Danish Southern Jutland dialect. And as well, my mom's dad and my mom's parents, they spoke Southern Jutland dialect as well, even if they felt that they were part of the German, and they considered themselves a part of the German minority. So it's really fucked up down. I mean,
right, it's very fluid. Everything's moving around, and nothing's really.
And with my dad's parents, I spoke with my grandparents on my father's side. We had a strange mix of. We were supposed to speak German, but there was all this Southern Jutland dialect and low German language, and then sometimes it was High Danish and so on and so on.
Just a big melting pot. Well, that's what happens when you mix cultures, I guess. What made you leave, and when did you leave? Jutland.
Sønderborg. I left after high school.
Did you know you wanted to be an artist at that point?
Yes, I knew. Yeah, but there's a whole tradition of art history in my family. My great-grandfather, who used to know Nolde and was a friend of him, was a Sunday painter. He was a trained, house painter, and he's done all the marbling, as we call it, marmorering. I don't know what it's called in English, but the marbling, the fake marble paint on Schackenborg is his work, and my grandfather again was trained as a house painter by his father, and also painted in his spare time. So, and then my uncle has been to the art academy and Egil Jacobsen in the early 60s. So, and was actually the co-founder on Kanonklubben, which was experimental art collective in the mid 60s. Working with Canon Super 8 cameras and so on. And then he later became a communist, and he is an abstract painter and became a communist, but during his membership of the Danish Communist Party, he couldn't really paint abstract. It was considered bourgeois, so he didn't really paint in these years. He was
what a horrible conflict.
Politically active, and then he picked up the painting again after the Berlin Wall fallen.
Does that mean you were raised with that idea that you should be an artist?
Not at all. Not at all.
It just was kind of
not
around you.
But it was around me. But I was always interested in. I was drawing as a kid. I was drawing till I reached the 7th grade, and normally kids do that. Sometimes they even do it to the 9th grade or whatever. I had a period, I think it was in the 8th grade, maybe early 9th grade, but around 7th, 8th grade, I stopped for a year. I can see there's a little break there, and then I started again. And then from that on, I mean, considering what you're doing, looking at the drawings you do, I mean, most of the drawings you do till you're 13, 14 years old are narratives, representations of something that's just around you, and it's not very reflected and so on. It's maybe more about intuition and more about just having a good time with drawing. But after that, I was quite reflected. When I stopped and started again, we had a terrific teacher in the 9th grade, I think, or was it the 8th grade, who let us draw abstract drawings. He put on Black Sabbath. I mean, you must imagine we're talking about 1970 or something.
That's pretty wild, actually.
And he really blew up the volume, and then we were sitting there, and it had to be abstract, and he got totally mad when some of the female student or some of the female pupils said they didn't really use the color. They were very fragile and very soft and careful and so on. He got completely messy. You got the fucking colors to use them, so please use them. And then we were listening to Paranoid with Black Sabbath. It was fantastic. So he, in one hand, opened up again, and then I knew from my uncle, and we had my uncle's abstract paintings around us, and I started seeing cultural programs in the Northern German Channel 3 and NDR. So all of a sudden I was quite aware of that. And then the Danish library system was quite good at that time. I suppose it still is. But I mean, there was no such thing as Google or the internet. So information was quite rare those days. But I was able to get it through the local library. I guess I read all the art books there, and I saw the German television NDR3, and then I met in my high school time. I met this teacher Gerlach, which I had in the 9th grade. He was good, but then I really got a good teacher in high school who was Ole Prip Hansen, and he let me get close in the sense that I could visit him after hours and often had dinner with him and his wife and the kids and so on. So he became my mentor during those years. And
I'm finding that a teacher is really important.
It is.
In the beginning, it's really because there's that thing about just drawing because you like to draw or whatever, and then there's the point where you realize you can have goals before you start drawing and be like, I want to go somewhere, I want to do something, I want to express something, to think about what you're creating.
And I think there's some crucial years as well. It's a sort of a biographical cadence because you can see that till you're 13 or 14 maybe it's not very reflected, but all of a sudden all these huge issues come up and you start addressing them and then you get involved with them, and all of a sudden, as I did, I just happened to get a book on Asger Jorn, and I was feverish with the flu. I even think I had pneumonia, and I was down for 3 or 4 weeks. And my parents borrowed a book on Asger Jorn by Virtus Schade, which is not very okay, but they had a lot of illustrations. And all of a sudden, that triggered it, and then I think a year later, in '73, I saw the Asger Jorn Museum in Silkeborg, also coincidentally, because I thought it was a local historical museum. It wasn't called anything, it was just called Silkeborg Museum, or maybe even Silkeborg Kunstmuseum, but we asked for Silkeborg Museum, and then I saw Stalingrad and the huge mural of Dubuffet, which was on an old school building. It's not, I think it doesn't exist any longer, but it was an old school building. And then later on, the museum was down at the river and changed. But that was had a huge effect on me.
So you went to school then after that? You decided I need to go to art school, or?
I knew that I would do the high school because there was not, I was close to dropping out, but I think I realized because I was around, there was sort of a hippie clique at the high school, and quite a few of them dropped out, and in a way that was quite radical in a petit bourgeois environment as Sønderborg, and I was tempted to do it. I was very close to drop out, but somehow maybe my bourgeois spine sort of kept me going, but I applied
or
for
just plain sensibility.
I could have dropped out already after the second year in high school, because I applied for the art academy, and then didn't get in because my teacher Ole Prip Hansen said I should apply with some Croquis studies and nude studies and blah blah blah, which I'd never done, so I started doing them after photography and magazines and so on, but it didn't really work. So next year, when after high school, after gymnasium, was called studentereksamen, when I applied for the art academy, then I applied there and in Düsseldorf, and then in Düsseldorf I actually followed the rules that I put in all the nude studies and blah blah blah. But I thought in Copenhagen it wasn't really worth trying. Either they should accept what I was doing, and I sent in some conceptual work. It was in '77. It was inspired by Marcel Duchamp's Green Case and Green Box, and it was a suitcase filled with. Yeah, it was inspired by Fluxus, Marcel Duchamp, and Kossuth, and I guess some of the professors could tell. I know Wilhelm Freddy and Sven Dalsgaard said either he gets in or we are out of office. Because
they said that about you?
Yeah, because I was the only one who applied with no nude studies. It was just the suitcase.
So that's good timing that you didn't do it too early when it had to be exactly with nude classical studies.
So actually it was a pattern break at that time, because I guess I was the first one to be accepted without having the classical croquis nude studies with charcoal and blah blah blah.
So how was it when you arrived? Was it shocking? Was it exciting?
It was great because Sven Dalsgaard knew was aware that I was applying and got in, so he sort of really mentored me through. He said, "Drop the shit with the newts. You'll never learn it," and blah blah blah.
It's just not you.
So he gave me the space, and then immediately I met Peter Punde and Peter Carlsen, etc., etc. And we formed already a few weeks later. We were in a gang and a clique, and
it was just off and running.
So.
Do you think that art school was important for who you were? Because it sounds kind of like you already knew what you were doing to a certain degree before you even started.
I got all my basics was taught to me by Ole Prip-Hansen. I learned all the graphical techniques through him, a little bit through my uncle. I was introduced to, even if he's an expressionist painter, naturalist painter, a figurative painter who is more classical, he still introduced me to Pollock and Edward Hopper, and but also Andrew Wyeth,
right,
who nowadays nobody knows about, but was a quite interesting artist. So he was quite open, and what was most important was that in high school, I had him for 2 years in art in high school. And he let us do performances as work. So we were actually doing performance in high school.
In the 60s, or when was this?
No. It's started high school in 73. It's been so 74 to 76.
So that was also pretty new.
That was
time.
Totally new in the province of southern Jutland, and I mean, it wasn't only the studio for the art classes. We sort of occupied the whole school and brought it out into the whole school, and so it was really a very fertile situation, and a very sort of there was a lot of good energy there.
It sounds like you've always had kind of been in the right place for what you need to be doing throughout years.
It sounded. I mean, it was the late hippie period.
Right.
Our big brothers and big sisters had been hippies, and we sort of were hippies too. It was just a couple of years before punk came up.
Right.
And I came to Copenhagen with long hair and a beard and more or less hippie look. And 2 years later, I'd shaved the head and cut the long hair and the beard, and it was more or less a part of the next move. But I've always been interested in, let's say, the tradition is not so strange, because there is definitely a secret history of the 20th century, which you could call lipstick traces, as Grail Marcus has called it in his well-known book. It's a history which starts off maybe with surrealism and turns into revolutionary surrealism, that then again turns, which the revolutionary surrealist sort of implies Georges Bataille and Lacan and all these. They're sort of affiliated with revolutionary surrealism, and then it changes into lettrism, which then again changes into Situationist International, which is part of, or sort of pre-taking the 68 revolt in France. And then later on, the punk movement
everything started splintering.
Yeah, so it's splintered, but it's a tradition that the people who are in this tradition are quite aware of.
Right.
And I was really totally fascinated by the Situationists in the early 70s, and got all the material I could, which as a Dane you're lucky to get, because Asger Jorn was a co-founder of Situationism, and his brother Jørgen Nash and Jens Jørgen Thorsen were the people who founded Drakabygget and the second Situationist International, etc., etc. So it was quite easy to get that information,
right?
Because even the libraries in your local town would have maybe a few books on it. So it wasn't really that heavy to get. It was harder to get the anarchist literature, which was the other part I was interested in.
Right.
But I've always been quite aware of that tradition. So it's not a thing that sort of I'm recapturing here. I was aware of it in the early 70s, and I related to it. I remember when I applied for the Düsseldorf Academy, I wrote a curriculum which definitely pointed those out.
Right.
And then concrete poetry, which was a third pillar in my construct at that time.
When did you move to Germany? I saw on your website this morning.
That's later. That's many years later. That's
okay.
When is that? 86.
Okay. Well, let's jump back a second then. When you were done with school,
done with school?
Yeah, done with art school. What did
with art school or with high school?
With art school in Copenhagen.
Yeah.
Then what? Did you have to get a job at Tivoli, stamping tickets, or
starting in '77 with after the oil crisis, which really increased the situation in Denmark, the crisis in Denmark.
Was that a heavy crisis? Kind of like
yeah,
the one
it was an ideological crisis because we weren't in the EU at that time, and there was a vote in '72 for the EU, and there was a huge leftist nationalist movement against the EU.
Right.
And basically all the right wings were for pro-EU, and the left wings, the hippies, and the left-wing political parties were against it. But basically,
they were afraid of control, or what?
Yes. But it was out of a sort of left-wing nationalist project that had been going on for years, which then also at that time had a link to the 19th century with the big awakening of Danish nationalism in a progressive way by Grundtvig and Christian Kold, etc., etc. So it had a certain kind of it paid respect to a certain tradition in Denmark, but seen now in a rear window or a rear mirror, it's definitely it was out of a nationalist idea that it grew, but it was leftist. It wasn't.
That's interesting. The leftist nationalism, the exclusionism that they didn't want to, because now it's the right wing.
But it's still why. That's why we're not in the euro
in the eurozone.
So there's still some points of it. And then the oil crisis hit. And then the whole 68 movement had turned into a sort of totally blown fragmentation bomb, like small party, not even parties, they all called themselves party-preparing organizations.
Pre-parties of some sort.
Pre-party organizations, so which also caused a complete lack of utopia and energy, because they were fighting each other, and it really, I remember we a generation, I say we people who were born around 55, 57, grew up with what we would call the 5 dark years from 75 to 80, where everything was kind of on a frozen level, and it was really totally hard to sort of imagine that there was a way out of it. And then you had the Rote Armee-Fraktion in Germany, the RAF, who killed themselves, but it was claimed that it was murder, and Jean-Paul Sartre visited them, and et cetera, et cetera. So it was definitely ice cold, sort of heavy lead-like period.
Was this the collapse of the hippie?
Yeah, totally. Utopia? The collapse of economy because the oil crisis, the ideological collapse because of, the never-ending summer of love had become a grey autumn day, and it was really I couldn't imagine. I mean, I was doing conceptual art at that time, and it was. We spent 1 year sitting just discussing whether we should do objects or not objects, because it was very
ideological.
Custom fetishism, etc., etc.
Right.
So we really, I couldn't imagine surviving economically by doing art.
Wow.
That's basically I studied at the university in Copenhagen as well, science of literature, and I did that because I needed a second level. I couldn't just do art. I needed some reflection, bipolar reflection, which could sort of angle the whole all the issues I was addressing at that time.
Right.
But I guess in hindsight, it probably also has to do with the fact that if you can't make it as an artist, you can at least become a teacher, teaching literature and art, either at a high school or a high school or wherever you might find it.
I also think it's really important to have other things in your brain than just art.
But I was lucky then, because around 1980 the ideological situation shifted, And through my university studies, I met people who were discussing post-structuralism and things that sort of came up in the late 80s, but we were in Denmark quite aware of it because people who knew were quite good at French translated it into Danish. I mean, if you see the whole reception of the post-structuralist notion or paradigm in the States and the English-speaking countries, it has to do with the fact when it was translated. So and which was basically 5 to 10 years later than in Europe. I mean, there were the publishing house Merve already published in German a little part of Deleuze-Guattari's work, and in Denmark we had Lacan and Derrida translated and so on. So we were quite aware of it at an early stage. I mean, Derrida had been translated into Danish as early as 67 or 69. So
is that just through the efforts of people who wanted to introduce this into?
Yeah.
Wow.
And in that sense, I got in contact with that, which was the circle of semiotics here in Copenhagen, psychosemiotics, and it was fantastic because we were reading all this stuff, which later on became quite predominant in the English-speaking art world in the late 80s. We were reading that in 79, 80, 81. So for me, this was another thing, which was actually, I mean, I've been trained at the university and at the art academy, but many of my basic experiences and my basic learnings have been through other private persons or small circles or reading groups or discussions or even in working at a printing house. Not working at a printing house or as an employee, but doing all these books I've done and being there, making them on the spot in the printing house has taught me how to make books and so on. So all these abilities you get after a while are basically not from the main institutions like the Art Academy and the university. They're sort of scattered around and collected when I had the possibility to collect them.
I definitely agree about that. For me, I learned the most about art by working at a camera store and working at a frame shop. Not from art school. Art school helps provide a space, a centralized space to meet in, but it doesn't always work. But I feel like this idea that there's reading groups and discussion together and all that doesn't exist as much anymore. If it does,
I was recently asked in an interview why, and I think it is because information is so available now. It's so, I mean, you're sort of, it's an informational shower you're in at the moment, and it's an ocean. But the ocean at some point, at many points, doesn't seem very deep. It's very shallow. It's almost as if you could walk from Europe to America on an ocean which is at least not more than a few feet deep, but it's huge.
Right.
In those days, you had to do all these. You had to join all these small, let's say, obscurant, clandestine groups because they would have the information. I remember getting my first anarchist books in a store in Trondheim in Norway because there were some anarchists up there. I traveled in Germany and met anarchists there and found the bookshops there, but it was more or less coincidental or more or less by coincidence that I would find them. And if you had to order them, you should have to know where to get in contact with them. And
send some money to some weird address.
And I remember the first mail art projects, which I was a little bit a part of here in Denmark, also were quite. It was sort of like an internet, but on a postcard level. But you would have all these addresses of persons you'd never known and you would never see and you would never talk to, but you would get post from them and you would have a sort of ongoing exchange of postcards. And I think email and fax mail is almost forgotten nowadays. But it was quite a huge thing for a year or two. But not email, the mail art and the fax mail art were sort of what do you call it, preceders of, is it, what do you call it, preceders of the
They precede.
internet? Yeah. They preceded the internet.
Right. It was
but that's why you also had these small groups and reading groups and clandestine groups and circles, because information was gold these days.
Right.
And that was also a way to sort of exclude a certain kind of group. I mean, in the early punk days, we used to say punk could be for everybody, but it's not for God and everybody. But
right.
It could be. I mean, in Danish we said it's hard to translate, but it goes like det for alle og enhver, men ikke for Gud og hver mand.
Yeah, I'm not sure what Gud og hver mand means.
Yeah, but Gud og hver mand means
it's not for everybody. Anyways.
Yeah. So you really had to. I mean, you had to have a huge will to get into it, and
right.
You almost had to fight your way into it. Nowadays, it's just you find it on the street through the internet.
Right. So you guys were the internet in 1979.
to me, I think mail art was a certain preceder of the internet.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean. Yeah, it both makes information cheap and shallow. You can find, I mean, it's incredible what you can find now, but you don't have to meet up in a dark apartment somewhere.
No, but it's funny, if you really want to, I mean, there's a lot of information, but if you really want to get into it, you have to find the right database, or you have to buy a book at some, I don't know, bookfinder.com, and then some weird guy in Indiana, the States, or some guy in the Czech Republic has that book, and you still have to order it and get it.
Right.
Because the real stuff is not scanned. I mean, it's the huge gathering of information is on its way, and it goes, and everybody who nowadays produces information puts it into the internet.
Right.
But I mean, a lot of the historical, very important stuff is not in the internet. You might find a hint there, but you still have to buy the book.
Right.
So I think
you might find the first few pages, but not the entire book.
You can find some what do you call it, smagsprøve.
Right, a little sample.
Samples, yeah.
It's funny because I'm just old enough to have seen that change.
Yeah.
I remember when I was a kid, there was all these addresses where you could send a little bit of money and receive something, whether it was comic books. I mean, there's something called the Anarchist Cookbook in the U.S. You probably heard about it. And I remember when I was in 8th grade or something, I was.
But that's from the late 70s, isn't it?
It is, but it was still going around, and someone had an address you could send money to and get a copy. And this was a big deal. And don't tell your parents. And there was all this stuff, and there was phone hacking with the public phones. You could find out how to steal free phone calls. All this weird stuff. But that disappeared. Right around the time I was 18 or something. Then there was all online after that. Well, not all, but a lot of it was. But let's jump forward. Germany. Why did you move to Germany?
I guess, I mean, I'm married to a German. My wife is German. I grew up with a German minority. My references, I mean, it's quite interesting change that has been in when I started at the academy in 77, and I was talking about Joseph Beuys, and I'd been to the Documenta in 77. People didn't really, I mean, we were much more English, American oriented. What you call the interest was much more on American or English, British art, and especially in Sweden, which is a predominantly hegemony of American art, and a few Danish and also like the Ekskolen, who had Beuys up in the 60s, and so a few Danish artists have been interested in German sort of cultural production, but basically literature, film, art, and so on in Denmark, and especially in Sweden, was about American art.
Right.
And I've always looked south. I mean, I'm interested in American art, and I was, but I've always been quite aware of the German tradition. I grew up with Emil Nolde. We saw the Emil Nolde Museum when I was 5, and for the first time, and I remember all these visits.
Right.
So German art and culture is a huge part of my background and my luggage. And at that time, it seemed, I mean, Cologne was really sort of a center at that time. And I really thought, okay, give it a try. It would be nice to live there. There was no problem bringing my wife there. She was German, even if she wanted she wanted to stay in Denmark.
Right.
It seems that many foreigners are more fond of Denmark than Danes of Denmark.
Danes like to trash Denmark at least.
But the whole thing, in a way, changed in '92 when we. I mean, the thing with the Second World War was actually an issue up in the 70s, in the 80s still.
Oh, those goddamn Germans!
Yes,
that kind of thing.
yeah. And then all of a sudden it changed when we won the European Cup
in '92
and beat in '92 and beat Germany. And the strange thing about it was the biggest. The biggest mass of the biggest public convention on the town hall square since '45.
Wow!
On that occasion, I mean, there were so many people at the town hall square that changed. After that, Berlin became very popular. After that, everybody goes to Berlin.
Okay, we beat you. Now you're okay.
Yeah, it's sort of now it's okay. Now it's okay. You pay back time, and it's okay. We're even and
politics and soccer.
Yeah. I mean,
wild.
That's how I see it. I'm probably wrong, but that's how I see it.
That makes sense to a certain
But for
degree.
me, it was never. I mean, I was more or less fluent in German, so it was no big deal going down there. And I thought, I said, why don't we give it a couple of years and see? And then in 91, 92, when our daughter was born, I was part of the Sydney Biennale. And we went to Australia for 3 or 4 months, and had a really great time there. But I mean, money was really low. It was the crisis that started in strange again. In '87, there was a little crisis in America, on little Wall Street crack. But we didn't really get it to Europe before until 1991. And all of a sudden then, I remember the first really big sign of the crack hitting Europe was when all the American galleries came to the Frankfurt Art Fair and pinned their drawings up. Everybody was showing drawings. Nobody showed paintings, because it was a suitcase, big drawing. You could show, and then you wouldn't frame it, you would pin it up, and that's where the whole aesthetic of the pinning drawings came up, because everybody did it. And crisis, it was a aesthetic produced by a crisis, which predominated the whole art world in the early mid-90s. Everybody who would look really advanced and avant-garde would put the pin their drawings to the wall.
That's hard to pull off now.
It's hard for a framer like you to imagine, but but that was very, very, very avant-garde at that time. But there was a crisis symptom. And then when we got back from Australia, we didn't have that much money, and coincidentally at that time I was offered a guest professorate. And since we didn't have that much money, I thought, okay, we can stay in Cologne, and I'll just be commuting between Cologne and Copenhagen. But with a kid, and I hate to commute such distances. Yeah. I mean, at that time, the air tickets, the flights were quite expensive, and so you had to do it by train, and it's an 8 or 9 hours trip. So I wasn't really interested in that. So basically, we moved to Copenhagen when I had the guest professorate, and then I thought when the professorate was to be announced, and then I thought, okay, I might apply for it, and then I got it, and then everything was sort of okay. Now we buy a house. It was a perfect time to buy a house, because it was just after another crisis where the house prices were really on a low, and then all of a sudden the interest, the
interest rates
fell, but the prices didn't really come up till a couple of months later, and we just bought in that interregnum there. Timing is key. Yeah, timing is key. I was the first one time I was really lucky in my life in that sense. And then we thought, okay, I love Copenhagen. I must say, what I missed in Cologne were really these the feeling of living next to the sea. Salty sea. I mean, the Rhine is quite a lot of water in
right, but it's not the
Colombia.
sea.
It's not the same. It's an inland climate, and I love the coast climate.
So you weren't sad to.
That's why I loved LA basically, because I thought LA just had everything. It has the perfect climate and has the sea next to it. So what I miss in LA, of course, are then the changes of the seasons and so on. But
yeah, I mean, I have to not like LA because I come from San Francisco. Yeah. That's the rules.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's almost Copenhagen in California.
Right. But I see the benefit. I think LA is actually quite beautiful. It's wild. There's no center. It's just crazy. It's anarchy in a way. It's the most anarchistic city. But you weren't sad to move back to Denmark then. I understand.
I mean, Cologne was from the beginning a project. It wasn't really to last. I remember we were offered to buy an apartment, and we just decided at that time that buying means that you sort of consider yourself staying in Cologne, and because if you buy, you have to leave it. I mean, it only makes sense if you want to live there 5 or 10 years.
Right.
And at that time in '91, we were actually talking about moving to Berlin. So if I hadn't got the professorate, we might have moved to Berlin. But then I figured that Berlin is so close to Copenhagen that I mean, you can as well live in Copenhagen, just go down. I mean,
right.
And I knew Berlin from the early 80s, where a lot of my friends used to live there, but they all moved on to Western Germany or back to Copenhagen. And it was hard for me in the beginning, sort of, to cope with the geography of Berlin, because my whole sort of mental mapping of Berlin was completely different from
there was a wall.
Now. Yeah, there's a wall. So in my head, there was it took me until recently, maybe just 5 or 6 years ago, I had my problems finding around I mean, if it wasn't for Auguststrasse and Mitte, which easily is to find, I had my problems getting around in the former east section of Berlin.
Right.
Because my whole mapping, and I have the same with Paris, where I used to live half a year in 77. In the beginning, I had a complete, what you call it, mirroring of the map of Paris in my head.
Right.
And then I lived there for half a year, and then the whole map sort of changed. I'd visited Paris for a couple of times before I moved there, but for a very short period and a few days, and I always were out at night and so on. So I had it completely mirrored in my head.
Right.
That really happens sometimes.
Yeah, I know what you mean. There's a part of
maybe
Chicago.
That's a basic experience going all the way back from the Wembley Stadium experience that
perhaps
I mirrored the winner.
There's a major city in Chicago which is turned around in my mind. I lived there for 4 years. I know the city quite well, but there's one street where I say, okay, we need to go this direction, and it's always the other direction.
But it's quite strange because I normally have a quite good spatial feeling and spatial intelligence, but sometimes I really
there's just
totally
places that mess you up.
Yeah.
Tell me, they say that, or someone once said that to master you need to teach. Do you think that's true? Now you were a professor for 10 years.
To master what? I mean, in
to
what
master
sense?
your art, to master what you do.
Art.
Yeah.
Not necessarily.
Did it inform your art, do you think?
I've always been, quite early in the early mid-70s, I was aware that the work I was going to do, and I already was doing at that time, had a contextual level. It's always been part. That's why I went to university. It wasn't enough to be at the art academy. I needed something else. I've always angling my work. I'm always putting a certain perspective on my work, which always had a contextual level. Also in a very literal sense that texts are as important as pictures for me. And representation for me can exist on whatever level it is. It doesn't necessarily have to be figurative painting. It could be an abstract conceptual work. It could be whatever. So in that sense, all my work has been contextual and contextualizing and contextualized.
Right.
So teaching, and that means contextualizing means that you somehow go into a dialogue with some certain substance, some certain matter, and that matter might be sometimes be, groups, discussions, circles, reading sessions, blah, blah, blah. So I've been quite active on that front from the very early days. Also when, let's say, in way back where you found your cliques and so on, I always had different areas, fieldings where I was talking to different people, and they came, I mean, they were political, some of them were artists, some of them were writers, etc., etc. So that's not been an issue for me at all. And even if I hadn't applied for the professorate, my work at that already, and it was not only based on the fact that I needed money and I would get money from teaching. I also did teaching which didn't really pay off, but I've always been interested in the dialogue, and I've always been interested in you because you also get something back in return when you teach,
right?
And you test yourself. I mean, it's also testing of. Let's see, of your own ideas. Does this notion, is it watertight? Is it waterproof, and so on? So, and it's open as well. I mean, it's open to discussion. So it could even be altered, and it could become better, and all the arguments, etc. So I've always been quite open to that. I don't believe in the fact that making art is making art in solitude. That's basically, it's a job. It's a dialogue. It's a symbolic exchange which you always have to somehow to reflect in your work. So it was a natural part for me to apply for the professorate. And since they had asked me to be a guest professor, I thought, okay, it's now or never. You don't get this chances that many times in your life. I could feel that the students I had were quite happy with my teaching, and we had a good time and so on. So I had the feeling, okay, it's now or never. And when I had it, I must say the 9 years I had were terrific. It was stressful because I wanted to do my own work as well. So and I had a family, and so it was really stressful at that time. For that reason, I wouldn't do it again. But it also was a time where I thought it could be extremely productive, not only for my own work, but also for the institution, for the students. I mean, the exchange, the interchange was really something. So
I feel like to a certain degree you have to defend what you do when you're a teacher, because you have to say, I am actually good enough to stand here in front of you.
Yeah, but it's actually not a master teaching what I did, because since my work is so sprawled and spread and scattered in all kind of media and fields and so on, expressions and on any level, I didn't have the problem I find with the master teaching, that many of the students look like the master. So it wasn't really master teaching. I saw my teaching more in the tradition of a Michael Asher or Joseph Beuys in Düsseldorf, or Michael Asher in CalArts in California, where the whole idea is the whole idea of the teaching is a symbolic exchange, and what comes out of it might be really different. If you see the students that entered, you said the boys' school in Düsseldorf, they range from conceptual artists to Imi Giese to Palermo, from Ursula Reuter Christiansen to really wide range of expressions, wide range of approaches, and I mean, it's more or less the same for applies to Michael Asher's teaching. So that's a tradition I was, and I taught in the way the same way I was taught, or I was brought into, or I learned stuff. So I really took from all the fields I could find.
Right, it wasn't as much about your work.
No, it's been my upbringing has been that I was with a printing house, and then was a traditional printer, and then I was at the psychosemiotic circle, and then I was at the academy and the university. I was in the anarchist circle, etc., etc. And so I brought this into my own upbringing, and I thought this would be a nice way to do at the Art Academy as well, which at that time I think was quite exceptional, because we had all kind of people teaching there. I mean, not only...
Right, it creates a different kind of community.
Yeah.
We can start wrapping this up pretty soon, but I wanted to ask you about your gallery. You have you have this space next door here where you have a gallery where you don't sell work, you just show work.
It's not a gallery, it's more close to a salon in French idea of the salon in the 19th century, where you invite people into... No, it's not a private space because it's my workspace, but it still is, let's say, a more or less clandestine, obscure thing that you have to know. It's you have to know the code word, the shibboleth, and you have to ask. It's by private viewing only, and then I mean I show work from my own collection here. It's 76 shows, which already as a concept is written down, and just have to be absolved. And
why do you do it though?
I call it a curatorial exorcism. First of all, I thought curatorial exercise would be nice, but then I found out that it actually basically is an exorcism, that my whole approach to art is contextual, and that this is part of my work as well. And then in order to get it out of the system, out of my body, because I really have had this passion for many years to curate, and I've did quite a few public curatorial works. I did work with Arthur. I curated a show with Arthur Köpke, joint curated it with Helle Bøhlund in 2008. I've just recently done Picabia Schnabel Willumsen as a joint curatorial project with Anne Gregersen and Christian Wind. And I did with Per Brandt, my old teacher from the Copenhagen Semiotic Circle. In 2008, I curated a show called and a book as well, important thing to say, a show called The Map is Not the Territory. So I've done it for many years. I think my first curatorial thing goes back to the 80s. But here, with the amount of shows and this short span of time, 2 weeks, makes it extremely flexible, and you can really, it's like a living material, and you can work with it, and you it's I think it's an exorcism in the sense that I get it out of my body, and then I've tried all the things I want to do in a laboratory or in a mock-up, as a mock-up situation, and then I know I've learned really much about curating by doing that.
Right.
I mean, how things work together, and how you can how the scale, the relation, the space between works, etc., etc. So that's quite interesting.
That's great. I think it's great because it's not commercial.
Yeah.
There's very little art hung on a wall, and people are invited to come see that isn't commercial in some degree or another.
Yeah, but that's part of my old passion for the potlatch theory of the Kwajutl tribe in around Vancouver Island, who had these potlatch feasts where they sort of just gave away things. It was a sort of generosity there, which has also been described by Marcel Mauss, a French anthropologist, and especially Georges Bataille, a French writer and thinker, who had brought it on a more, let's say, abstract level. And I think it's a part of a general generosity, a general economics, that you give more away than you get,
right.
Which also is part of teaching. I mean, but teaching, if you do it in an institution, of course, is linked to a fee and to a salary, but teaching basically is a generous act of symbolic exchange. So. I see it as in that tradition. So now we're back to the secret history of the 20th century. It's a lipstick trace, which I sort of admit that I'm a part of.
Everything
I'm part
comes
of that,
back to
tradition.
that.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything you want to tell people about right now? Anything people should go see? You've got the show you just curated that's still on the walls.
Yes, it's until December 28, 2013 this year. It's a show called Café Dolly. It's at J.F. Wilhelmsen Museum in Frederikssund, in northern part of Zealand, Denmark here. And it's a show that relates J.F. Wilhelmsen, a Danish painter who died quite old, so he lived into the late 50s, but is more or less the same age as Francis Picabia, who is the other one who's shown, and Julian Schnabel, the filmmaker and painter. And we've sort of tried to relate those three to a certain discussion on also symbolic exchange, modernism in a more the more muddy way, and there's a lot of aspects that you can take out of that take out of that show. And
yeah, I've heard it's gotten a lot of positive press, so I think people should go up and see it.
Yeah.
Is there anything else? Did we miss anything?
I don't know. There's always something going on.
There's always something. All right, well, thank you.
Yeah, maybe the last thing, there's a catalog which is just out now on Danish artist books by Thomas Hvid Krohmann and a couple of others, Maria Kjær Tempsen and a couple of others, and which is now published on the German Walter König Buchhandlung Walter König is publishing it. And it's an English catalog on Danish artist books from the 1920s till today.
What's the title?
I don't know. Because I haven't seen it. Tonight I'll get my first copy. So
if you give me a link, I'll put it on the website when I put this up.
Great.
But
so
anyway,
that's it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for letting me talk to you.
You're welcome.
All right, that was our friend Claus. Nice man, interesting man, good artist, thinker, talker. We like Claus. He's got a lot of ideas, and we really hope to speak to him again because we really just started scratching the surface. We really we want to talk to Claus about anarchy. Let's get down to it. So hopefully we can get him back in the studio one day, chat with him some more. If you want to find Claus, you can find him just about anywhere on the art scene in Denmark. He's a prominent figure, and he's out and about. He's often at the openings. He's part of publications. It's also he mentions there at the end about the artist's book, Danish artist books publication, which just came out. He was part of that as well, and I have found a link. I will put that on the website as well. So find Claus. Find him anywhere. And thanks again for listening, guys. We're moving one step forward at a time. This episode was produced by Undergang Unlimited. You can find us at undergang.net. Intro and outro music provided by Heavy Links. You can find a link to them and their music on our About page. And the interstitial music is provided by Kevin McLeod. There's links to him in the show notes. Thanks again for listening, guys. See you next time.